Hello and welcome to Highland Country Fellowship. If we've not yet met, I'm Bill Rector. I'm the teaching pastor here. You know, you guys are so good to me. I'm learning faces before I'm learning names, and you guys are really good to me about understanding that and telling me your names again, sometimes for the 50th time, and I really do appreciate that. Today we're going to continue what we do every week, which you saw part of it, which is we have this beautiful worship. We bare our hearts before God. We acknowledge him present with us, and then we let him teach us through his word. Ideas that were written down 2,000 years before any of us other than Sammy were born. And it's only 1,800 years before Sammy was born. So we are in Luke, and we are in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, and we've been going verse by verse through this. Last week we covered these same verses, but we took a particular turn to it. And so it's a story I call the healing of two daughters. It's towards the end of Luke chapter 8. Jesus had just returned from a very eventful trip across the lake, which they call the Sea of Galilee. He went from Capernaum, where he had become almost famous for healing people and doing miracles and teaching, and crowds gathered around him. And he got in a boat, and he went across this lake to the Gentile side, where the non-Jewish people lived, and he cast on, by the way, on his way there, non-trivial thing, he calms a raging storm by rebuking the wind and rebuking the waves, right? I mean, I've yelled at objects before, but Jesus rebuked the wind, rebuked the waves, calms a storm. He gets to the other side of the lake, he casts demons, many, perhaps as many as 2,000 to 6,000 demons out of a man. And those demons run into a herd of pigs, and they run into the water and drown. And the people there are so scared of him, they ask him to leave. And he says, okay, which is an interesting thing. You know, I remember hearing from a pastor one time that God is a gentleman, and he will not go where he's not invited. And this is a verse right there. That's what Jesus did. But he did leave behind a calling card. That man who used to be a maniac filled with demons was now dressed and in his right mind, and he left them behind there to be a testimony and a witness to those Gentile people. And then he got in the boat and he left and he came back. And it wasn't just one boat with 12 people. It was probably an armada, maybe dozens, perhaps hundreds of boats, the way Mark and Matthew describe it. Lots of boats. Tell me if I need to switch microphones, but otherwise I think we can just suffer through that. That's all right with you guys. There we are. Just a little indigestion. I was eating some electrical wiring earlier. I'm terribly sorry. Thank you. Thank you for understanding. Yeah. Oh, gosh. Now you're just making that happen. Okay. So he gets back to Capernaum. I'll tell you what, let's take this up here. Let's go to God's word here. In Luke chapter 8, verse 40. Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a ruler of the synagogue, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. Then, when they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." The woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." While Jesus was speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead," he said. "Don't bother the teacher anymore." Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. Just believe, and she will be healed." When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. "Stop wailing," Jesus said. "She's not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what happened. And this, beloved, is the word of the Lord. It's such a beautiful story. It's really two miracles that happen here. That's why we call it the story, the healing of two daughters, right? And we spent a lot of time last week talking about the woman, but there's two daughters. There's Jairus' daughter, and then this woman that Jesus will call daughter. And Jairus' daughter, is 12 years old. The woman Jesus calls daughter was afflicted for 12 years. It's a miracle within a miracle. And so we really need to tell them a little bit together because they both stress the awesome power of Jesus, the life-giving power of Jesus. But they also stress this desperate faith that did not go unrewarded in him and his ability to do this. And sometimes we need to remember that ourselves, amen? So, as we said, there's a crowd that overtakes him, and as soon as he gets there, Jairus is waiting for him. And probably because there were many boats going, there were probably a few that got back early, and Jairus knew it, and he ran down. It appears he was, if I quit moving, maybe this stops, I don't know. Maybe he was right there at the shore of the lake to fix this. I mean, he was absolutely right there. Verse 41 says, "Then a man named Jairus, a ruler of the synagogue, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying." Okay? Now, Jairus was a synagogue ruler. Ruler's kind of a rough word. Administrator, it's not like he was king and wore a crown or anything, but he was in charge of the synagogue. Capernaum might have been a big enough town that maybe there were a couple of teaching rabbis, but Jairus would have been one of the people that decided what was going on that day in the synagogue. And he would have been in control of that. Now, because of that, he would have been in good with the Pharisees at the time. I don't know if Jairus was a fanatic about being a Pharisee, but he would have certainly catered to them. The Pharisees were the ruling party that would have been in charge of the doctrine that was being taught. So it's a little bit like in the old Soviet evil empire, you couldn't be mayor of Stalingrad without being a member of the Communist Party, right? There's no way you could be ruler of the synagogue, which in this culture would make you like mayor of Capernaum, without being in good with the Pharisees. And the Pharisees had already, by this time, decided that they got a problem with Jesus, and they want him out of the way. In Matthew, it even says that they were plotting to kill him, right? So if Jairus is a Pharisee, then he is not a fan of Jesus, and yet he's appealing to him. Even if he's not a hardcore Pharisee, he's taking his job in his hands. He's risking his future by appealing to Jesus, who the controlling party will hate. Do you see there's a little political intrigue there? And by the way, what would be such a big deal if he got kicked out of the synagogue that he was? It's not such a big deal. Well, it isn't to you and me, right? We actually joke about our church formerly being kicked out of a barbecue restaurant. It's a funny story. It really didn't happen the way I tell it so much. It really, we kind of just outgrew it, but it's more fun to tell people we got kicked out of a barbecue restaurant. It really wasn't quite that bad. That's the way I'm going to tell it from now on, at least. So, if you're in Dallas and you get kicked out of the Methodist church, you just go to the Episcopal church right across the street. We don't think of it as a big deal, right? But back then, it was that you could not trade. No one would talk to you. You had to leave town, and you had to leave a long way away. So this would have been a disaster for him. And don't miss, this is the mayor of Capernaum. Think of him as the leading person in that town. And he fell at Jesus' feet and begged him, right? And why would he do that? Well, he's risking a lot, and he's humbly doing this. And I think part of it is, let's not kid ourselves. When your family members are dying, right? This is what we call Bob Dylan theology, right? At this moment, you got nothing, and you got nothing to lose. Desperate times call for desperate measures. But there's something else about this. Jesus had been in the synagogue at Capernaum, and he cast demons out of a man there, right? And Jairus had to have seen that. Jairus believes in his heart that Everything else will fail, but this man can heal my daughter. And that's the important part of the faith that we want to cling on to. And there's a couple things about the story that we need to make sure we understand. All of the gospel writers mention she was 12. That doesn't maybe mean as much to us, but a 12-year-old girl in that culture is just getting ready. She's finished the childhood part of her life, and they're now thinking of her almost graduating on to adulthood. It would not be out of the question for a 12-year-old to be married, or given in married, or pledged to be married, right? This is not, our day and time. So she, as a 12-year-old, her parents are thinking, wow, just when she's getting ready to experience the adult portion of life, this tragedy is happening. And then Luke adds something else. It was his only daughter. So, there's a few bricks are heaped onto the tragedy here. So this is a terrible thing. Jesus then agrees. He must have agreed. We don't hear that. But he's on his way to Jairus' house. Verse 43 says, Jesus was on his way. The crowds almost crushed him, and a woman who was there who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years. And there was, but no one could heal her. So on his way to Jairus' house, he encounters this woman. And we talked so much about her last week. I hope you can remember so much of that. But it's really interesting. I don't want to repeat that, but it is important to understand the context of one miracle inside of another. So very quickly, she came up behind. She touched the edge of his cloak. Jesus says, "Who touched me?" And Peter, being Peter, just says, "What, are you out of your mind? Everybody touched you," right? And Jesus says, "No, someone touched me, and I'm not going on until I figure out who it is, because I felt the power go out of me." Now, no one snuck up and stole power from Jesus. He consciously healed this woman, and he wants to take time and call her out because he doesn't want to just physically heal her. He wants to call her back in. She's been an outcast. She's been bleeding for 12 years. No one could touch her. She's been unclean, and he wants to call her back in to the community, and he wants to adopt her, and he wants to let everybody know, this woman that was outcast, I'm calling her daughter, right? He wants to do that, so he's taking the time to do that. And then he says to her, "Daughter," she says, verse 47, "Then the woman, seeing she could not go unnoticed, came trembling at his feet, and in the presence of all the people she told why she touched him and how she'd been healed. And then he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace.'" And the word healed there is the Greek word sozo, which it means so much more than just healed. It would be like if we ran into a fire and grabbed a baby, we sozoed the baby. We healed them, but we saved them too. And that's why that word has a multi-dimensional meaning to it. It's going to matter because it comes up later. So this is a beautiful story. We talked about it last week, but now I want you to see this through the eyes of the mayor of Capernaum, Jairus, who has just been waiting for Jesus, and I'll bet he doesn't wait for many people. He probably doesn't wait for a table at Chili's, right? And he's waiting for Jesus. He gets Jesus to come with him. Jesus stops along the way to heal somebody else. What? What are you doing? And not just somebody else, somebody that's clearly not worthy and unclean according to Hebrew culture. Not only does he stop to heal her, he stops and takes a little extra time to heal her and identify her. From Jairus' point of view, or the point of view from somebody who's a Pharisee of that day, what's he doing? Why is he doing that? And this is why these two miracles are related. This is why they're told closely together. It's really, really important. Jesus wants to teach a lesson. I'll tell you, a pastor told me one time, and it's just never been more true, Jesus is always teaching. Everything he does is a teaching example, a lesson. And this is what he's doing right here. And sometimes we have to be in the right frame of mind before we can be taught. And I was one of those students, and I can tell you as a math teacher, right? Ralph, I agree with you, brother. I'm with you, right? I can tell you I have had some gifted children that I was teaching math to. They absolutely were certain they knew how to work a problem, and their mind was not open to learning the right way until I handed the test back with a lower grade than they were expecting, right? This sometimes happens. And I'm not calling them out. Come on, this is human nature, right? When we think we know something, we're the most dangerous, right? And it's in this pain, it's in this desperation that Jesus has Jairus right where he wants him. C.S. Lewis wrote this. It says, pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our consciousness, but shouts in our pain. It is a megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Do you relate to that? Sometimes the time we're most on our knees is when we are in pain. And God knows that. He understands how we're built. And it's during that time when he's got some great lessons for us. So lesson 1 for Jairus, there's nobody more important in my eyes than anyone else. And you better get that right. You might be the mayor, and that might be your daughter, but on the way we're going to heal my daughter. And that's why I'm going to call her that. And I'm going to teach you a lesson about who might be my daughter. Amen? Let us never forget that. Let us never forget that. On the anniversary of Martin Luther King Day and other days where we pray that people will judge by the content of our character and what is in our soul, let us never forget Jesus called this lowly, unworthy woman daughter and stopped on the way to heal the mayor's daughter. Okay? And I'll bet Jairus may be past caring at that moment. I'll bet he is. But there's another lesson for Jairus, and it's coming up. When Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. Your daughter is dead, he said. Don't bother the teacher anymore. And this is probably a compassionate way, a friend telling him, Jairus, I know. Jairus was probably frantic. Where's Jesus? Where's Jesus? I got to get Jesus. I know that Jesus can heal her. Where's Jesus? I'm going to go wait down by the water. Come get me, And his friends probably know this. And they come to him and say, Jairus, I'm sorry. I know you had this thing planned, but it doesn't matter anymore. Your daughter's gone. You don't have to bother the teacher anymore. That's probably the way that news was delivered. And that would be a very sinking and deflating message, wouldn't it? And maybe you've been there. You've held out hope that the test results would be something different than what they were, and they came back and they weren't. Or you've held out hope. It looks like we're going to get through this part. It was risky, but we got him to the ICU. It looks like it's okay, and then all of a sudden the news comes back and it's not what we hope. Right? This is crushing. Hearing this, verse 50, Jesus said to Jairus, and what I want you to do is, they do this today where they do this with your fingers right there. I want you, Jairus, look at me, Jairus. All right? Do not be afraid. Just believe, and she will be healed. I want you to grab the importance of that moment. Because that's lesson number 2 for Jairus, right? You got it, Jairuses? Are you with me? Do not give in to this. And it reminds me of what Jesus was teaching in John chapter 11 when Lazarus died. And I'd love to do a 7-week seminar on that, I think. But Lazarus was a friend of Jesus, and in John chapter 11, he gets word that he's sick. And he deliberately delays and waits for him to die before going to see him in Bethany. And he says to his disciples at one point, in John 11, verse 11, he says, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. That's going to be important later. But I'm going there to wake him up. And his disciples are like, well, if he's sleeping, that's good, right? He'll get better. And Jesus says, no. Verse 13. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So he clarifies it for him in verse 14. So he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there so that you may believe. There's a lesson in this. There's a lesson in this for Jairus. There's a lesson in this for the disciples and Lazarus, and there's a lesson in this for us. And he's doing the same thing when he says, don't be afraid, just believe. Now, I will tell you that people have contorted this verse. Charlatans have contorted this verse for a long time. And they've said, you see, if you believe, Jairus, I'll do this for you. Bull. That's not what this verse meant. Jairus had belief already. That's why he went down and his feet were still sandy from being on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. He had belief already. And Jesus is reminding him of that. And he's calling him back to that. And he says, don't be afraid. Keep believing, right? This is the song from Journey. Don't stop believing. Right? It's a shame that the lyrics aren't worthy of worship. Because I'll bet some of you have heard that song. Some of you don't look old enough to know that song. Don't be afraid, just believe. And she will be sozo. There's that Greek word again. She'll be healed. She'll be saved. I love it. So when he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Now this is interesting, because this is probably having to do with more space requirements than anything, right? Houses were tiny back then. Even if you had a house today, I mean, what are you going to try and fit 15 people into your daughter's room? I mean, it was probably more out of a space requirement thing. But this is the first time that Jesus peels away a few of those 12 disciples. And it's usually Peter, James, Andrew, and John. Those are the fabulous four that get invited to come see some special things with him. So this is the first time that we see a subgroup of the disciples going in. And it might have been, and it probably was, a space requirement, but it was also something we're going to discover in verse 56. And that is, he doesn't want everyone to know what goes on in that room. And there's no way of avoiding the fact that a girl was dead and is now going to be alive again. I mean, you're not going to hide that. But he doesn't want everybody to know exactly what happened inside that room. Let them figure that out. So meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her outside of Jairus' home, and Jesus says, stop wailing. She's not dead, but asleep. And they laughed at him, see, because they knew that she was dead, right? We're never more dangerous than when we think we know. And we've spoken this before. When we were in chapter 7, we were talking about healing the widow's son in the village of Nain, and the funeral, what that would have looked like. Christian funerals are different. You know, they're solemn because we respect the fact that those that are living here are going to miss this person. But we know we do not grieve as those who have no hope. So they might be quiet and solemn, but they're not hopeless. The Jewish funeral was hopeless and loud. It was not loud with celebration. It was loud with dissonant music and cymbals and wailing. They would hire a flute player and then another flute player to play out of tune with each other to try and get you in the mood. They wanted to, through music, make you feel as bad as the suffering family. That's what happened if I were to sing, right? This is what they would do. Sometimes they would hire professional mourners and wailers. I'm not kidding. From the Jewish Virtual Library, here's a quote. In rabbinic times, funeral processions were led by lamenting female mourners, often professionals. Well, I tell you, I know some people that would be perfect for this job. They'd make a killing. No pun intended. I'm sorry. I didn't. Did you see what I did there? Thanks, Steve. Okay. We put the fun back in funeral. Okay, they quote no, just spell it once, that's all. The Mishnah quotes a rabbi as saying that even the poorest in Israel should hire not less than 2 flutes and 1 wailing woman for his wife's funeral. Right? So your wife passes away, you want to make sure you do the minimum, 2 flutes and 1 wailing woman. Right? It's funny to think about. So Jesus is just sick of this, right? I mean, if it were me, I would have said this differently. He probably was just like, stop wailing, stop it. You know, like a loving father would say to quiet down his children. The sinful me, I would have been much different. But even the language indicates that it was fairly abrupt. Stop this, stop it. And then he says, she's not dead, but asleep. And there's that same language as Lazarus. You know, this is as good a time as any to talk about this because, you know, was Lazarus really dead? And Jesus says, yes, he was dead. He used the word dead. Was Jairus' daughter really dead? Well, verse 55 is going to tell us when we get there that her spirit returned to her. So I'm going with yes, right? And this is different because to us, it's dead by every human measurement. By God's standard, it's asleep. And I think it's really worth talking about. You know, I got to tell you something. As I get older, this gives me hope. And I want you to know this. There's some verses. You know, I mean, people ask me, what happens to a Christian when they die? And I say, I don't know. I really don't. And if I did, I couldn't tell you. But I think the Bible gives us some fantastic verses. And maybe you want to scribble some of these down and read through them and study them. You know, Jesus does know what happens because it actually happened to him, and he is the God that authors these verses. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 and 14. Brothers, we don't want you to be ignorant about those who fall asleep, right? Or to grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. We believe that Jesus died and rose again, so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. That's good news, brothers and sisters. And it gets better. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, actually that whole chapter is really good for people, for all of us that are eventually going to be facing this. This 2 Corinthians 5 may be the best whole chapter, but in verse 6 it says, therefore, we are always confident, and we know that as long as we are at home in the body, we're away from the Lord, right? We live by faith, not by sight. So we're confident, I say, and would prefer to be away from the body and present with the Lord. Maybe you've heard the original language, absent from the body, present with the Lord. This is where we get that. So we make it our goal to please him, whether we're in the body or with him. That's just perfect logic, isn't it? You're with Jesus, whether you're here or whether you're with him. Paul's like, I don't care. Doesn't really matter, does it? I'm like, oh, you're talking about death, Paul? Yeah, I'm with Jesus either way. He's been comforted by that. It's amazing. And maybe one of my favorites is in Luke 23, verses 42 and 43. There's a thief hanging on a cross next to Jesus. They're being executed, and this thief has the providential foresight to say, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Now, is that the stupidest thing you've ever heard? Does he look like he's going to come into his kingdom? Maybe not on an earthly level, but on a spiritual level, this man saw beyond his own life and said, remember me. And Jesus said, I tell you the truth. Today you will be with me in paradise. Is that not comforting? Today. So whether it's sleep or death, with the body apart, Jesus says, look, when you get rid of this body that is filled with fallen, sinful nature, and you come to be with me, you'll be with me in paradise. Brothers and sisters, don't take my word for it. Read God's words for this, right? Does that not bring you some comfort? I just felt called to tell you that while we were talking about that today. So who knows what happens? Well, God knows, and he's told us, which is why it's so funny in verse 53 when they laughed at him, knowing. See, they know. Leo Tolstoy, the Russian writer who is also a Christian, this is the only thing I could find of his that wasn't 70 pages long, but it's a beautiful quote. He said this, the most difficult subject can be explained to the most slow-witted man if he has not formed any idea of them already. But the simplest thing cannot be made clear to the most intelligent man if he's firmly persuaded that he knows already, without a shadow of doubt, what is laid before him. Does that make sense? Regardless of intelligence, it's our humility. This is why the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Right? Amen. Verse 54. Jesus took this little girl now back to the little girl. And he said, my child, get up. Mark says it differently. Actually, it's the same thing. Mark says, he took her by the hand and said, Talitha cum. I've been practicing that. I hope that's the right pronunciation. That's Aramaic. But Mark translates it for us so we don't have to worry, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. Right? So this did not take long. Luke says in verse 55, her spirit returned and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them, give her something to eat. I mean, when the all-being master of time, space, and dimension says to you, get up, you're going to get up. What's great is that for you and I and those of us who know him and he knows us and he's living in our hearts, we're going to get up willingly and say, yes, sir. And the rest of the world is going to get up not because they wanted to, but because they have to. See, at one point, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. I'm so glad that when that happens, it will be willingly for me, right? You know, Mark said it happened immediately. Luke said it happened at once, right? Here's a good lesson. When E.F. Hutton speaks, people listen, right? I don't know if some of you remember that. That dates me a little bit. That's like a 70s TV ad campaign. When the maker of the universe says get up, you're going to get up. And then he says, give her something to eat. I've quoted that verse many times. I write it on birthday cards and stuff like that. Really, I think a waste is a terrible thing to mind. Thank you. I'm here through Sunday. I know. I got 2 drummers. I got no rim shots when I need them, and it's just. Why would he say that? Well, part of it is, this is one of the ways that you prove that this is not a spirit or an apparition. Jesus did the same thing after he was resurrected. When he's dealing with these people, he said, hey, you want to see that it's really me? Look at the wounds in my hands. And then he says, do you have anything to eat? And he eats some fish in front of his disciples. So he's like, this is a real human recreative restoration again. Give her something to eat. And then he told her parents, last verse of the chapter, we're finally here. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what happened. Well, you're not hiding this, right? Sometimes Jesus told people not to tell because he doesn't want to have huge crowds pressing against him, right? You're not hiding the fact. The whole village knows that your daughter was dead and now she's alive. So this can't be to try and keep it quiet. But I really do think that this is one of the reasons. Remember, chapter 8 began with Jesus teaching in parables, and he said, he who has ears, let him hear. And I think that's what he's saying. He says, you know, for those of us, and those of us in this room that are privileged to humble ourselves before God and let him teach us, we know what went on in that room. He called a little girl's spirit from wherever it was. Maybe it was with him all along, and he called it back to her. Right? And she got up like that. Let the rest of the town wonder what happened, since they knew. Because they'll be just dealing with one fact. She was dead, and now she's alive. And I think that's the end of our story for us, too. You know, and perhaps, like Jairus, your faith is at a crossroads. Maybe this week something happened to you that just took the wind out of your sails, and the whole world is ready to laugh along and just give you all reason to doubt. And God is whispering to some of us. He's speaking to some of us, and maybe he's yelling at you. And he says, hey, don't be afraid. That same faith that you had in me to go down to the water, that same faith that you had in me a week ago, just believe. And you will be sozo, saved and healed. Oh, Father in heaven.